The ceaseless, metallic hum of Chicago's elite resonated through the apex. A restaurant so high above the city it felt detached from the mortal world below. Here on the 95th floor, deals were not made. Dynasties were forged in the crucible of hushed conversations and the clinking of crystal. For Alistair Cromwell, a man whose net worth was a number with too many commas for most to comprehend, the evening was a calculated exercise in controlled surrender. At 68, his hair was a shock of silver, meticulously styled, a stark contrast to the storm gray of his eyes. Those eyes, which could dissect a balance sheet from 20 paces, were currently fixed on the man sitting opposite him, Marcus Thorne. Thorne, a predator in a bespoke suit, was circling Cromwell Industries like a vulture. This dinner was the final act, the ceremonial signing of a treaty where Alistair was effectively ceding a portion of his kingdom to save the rest. The pressure in Alistair's chest was a familiar, unwelcome guest. It wasn't the altitude, it was the ghost of his legacy, a legacy he felt was already turning to ash in his mouth. "Everything to your liking, Alistair?" Thorne's voice was smooth, a polished river stone that had been worn down by years of insincere pleasantries. He swirled a Bordeaux in his glass that cost more than the monthly rent of the people serving it. Alistair's jaw tightened into a knot of granite. "I'm still waiting on my Sazerac. With the 18-year Sazerac rye, a cube of raw sugar, and exactly 3 dashes of Peychaud's. The lemon peel expressed, not dropped. It's been 12 minutes. He made it sound not like a missing cocktail, but like a breach of national security. His gaze swept the room, a weapon seeking a target, searching for the source of this profound incompetence. He saw her then, a flicker of frantic movement through the forest of tables. A young woman, early 20s at most, her auburn hair escaping a hastily made bun. Her uniform, a simple black dress and white apron, was immaculate, but her face was a canvas of controlled panic. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes wide. This had to be the delinquent. Clara Mayhew felt as though her veins were filled with fizzing Alka-Seltzer. The L train had been held at Fullerton for 20 minutes due to a police action, forcing her to sprint the last 6 blocks in unforgiving flats. She was a ghost in her own life, haunting the halls of her library, science master's program by day, floating through the opulent rooms of the Apex by night, and studying in the pre-dawn hours to keep the precarious structure of her existence from collapsing. She was an orphan of the state, a graduate of the foster care system, and lateness wasn't a flaw. It was a sin that could cost her shelter. She saw the maître d', a severe man named Jean-Pierre, give her a look that could freeze fire. She seized the silver tray holding Alistair Cromwell's hyper-specific Sazerac, her hands trembling almost imperceptibly. Table 7, the Leviathan. Jean-Pierre's warning echoed in her ears. Mr. Cromwell does not tolerate error. He does not forgive imperfection. He is not a man. He is a metronome. As she approached the table, she could feel the arctic chill of his impatience rolling off him in waves. Marcus Thorne watched her, a slight, cruel smile playing on his lips. This was sport to him. "Your Sazerac, sir," Clara said, her voice a strained whisper. She moved with a practiced grace, born of 1,000 hurried shifts, leaning in to place the heavy crystal glass on the coaster. The rich scent of rye and anise filled the air. Alistair did not look at her. He looked at his watch, a Vacheron Constantin that represented more money than she would likely see in a decade. 13 minutes, he stated, his voice a low, menacing rumble. "I have been seated for 20. It took you, a person whose sole function in this ecosystem is to ferry items from point A to point B, 13 minutes to accomplish that task. Justify this failure." Clara's mind went blank. The truth, the stalled train, sounded like a pathetic, well-worn excuse. The lie she couldn't invent felt even more foolish. I apologize, sir. The delay was unavoidable. It will not happen again." "No," Alistair snapped, his stormy eyes finally locking onto hers. The force of his gaze was a physical blow. "It most certainly will not, because you are fundamentally unsuited for a role that demands elementary time management. In my world, a 13-minute lapse in judgment can liquidate fortunes. It reveals a deep, structural flaw. a lack of discipline, a lack of respect. It is a defect of character. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to dip. Nearby diners suddenly found their entrees fascinating, their wine glasses requiring intense study. Clara felt a scalding blush climb her neck, a wave of heat that felt like shame. Her heart was a trapped bird beating against her ribs. She willed the tears that stung the back of her eyes to retreat. She would not break in front of this tyrant. "Sir, Do not sir me," he cut her off, his voice rising, a precisely calibrated increase in volume to capture the attention of the entire section. "I am paying for excellence, not a front row seat to your professional inadequacies." "Jean-Pierre," he called out, his voice cracking like a whip. The maitre d' materialized at his elbow, his face a waxy pale mask. "Yes, Mr. Cromwell." "Remove her," Alistair said, a flick of his wrist dismissing Clara's entire existence. "She is terminated. I do not wish to be subjected to her presence for another second." Fired. The word hit Clara with the force of a physical impact. Just like that. Her tuition payment, her rent, her carefully balanced house of cards, all of it tumbling down. A cold, sharp panic sliced through the humiliation. "No, no, please." "Sir, please," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "I need this job." It was the worst possible thing she could have said. It was a confession of weakness, of neediness. Alistair's expression curdled into one of profound disgust. He had spent a lifetime excising weakness from his world, treating it like a contagion. "Your needs," he said, leaning forward, each word a perfectly polished stone of cruelty, "are of less than zero consequence to me." He was about to turn away, to banish her from his reality, when his gaze snagged on something. A small, dull gleam of silver against the worn navy blue of her cardigan, pinned just below her collarbone. As she had pleaded, her shoulders had slumped forward, catching the light. It was a brooch exquisitely detailed, in the shape of a hummingbird in mid-flight, its wings arched as if tasting nectar. Alistair's breath hitched in his throat. The world, with its billion-dollar deals and 13-minute Sazeracs, dissolved into a roaring static. The blood drained from his face. It wasn't just a brooch. It was the brooch. The brushed silver, the almost imperceptible flaw on the tip of one wing, where the soldering had been slightly too heavy. The way the tiny sapphire eye seemed to capture and hold the light. He knew its every curve, its every line. He had sketched the design himself on a cocktail napkin one rainy afternoon. The tirade died on his lips. All he could see was that silver bird. He had commissioned it from a reclusive artisan in Vermont for his daughter Eleanor on her 21st birthday. He had watched her pin it to her jacket, her green eyes so full of fire and rebellion, shining with a rare, unguarded joy. It was the last birthday they ever celebrated together. 7 years ago, Eleanor had vanished. A chartered sailboat trip in the Caribbean. The official story was that the boat was found adrift, a single, unexplained distress call logged. Her body was never recovered. The brooch, which she wore constantly, was gone with her. A piece of his soul had been carved out that day, leaving a void that all the money in the world could not fill. And now that same silver hummingbird was pinned to the cheap cardigan of a flustered, incompetent waitress he had just publicly crucified. The planet stopped turning on its axis. Alistair Cromwell, a man who built an empire on the bedrock of predictability, was suddenly cast adrift in a violent sea of disbelief, buffeted by a terrifying, impossible surge of hope. His voice, when he finally found it, was a strangled, alien sound, a rasp of gravel and dust. "Where?" he choked out, his eyes locked on the brooch, a drowning man seeing a phantom lighthouse. "Where did you get that?" The shift in Alistair Cromwell was so sudden and violent, it was like witnessing a mountain cleave in two. One moment, he was a tempest of controlled fury. The next, a man carved from salt and sorrow. The rage in his face had collapsed inward, leaving behind a pale, hollowed-out mask of disbelief. His eyes, just moments ago instruments of icy disdain, were now wide with a raw, vulnerable emotion Clara couldn't possibly decipher. It was a terrifying cocktail of agony and something that looked like a prayer. Marcus Thorne leaned forward, his shark-like senses tingling at the scent of blood in the water. "Alistair? Something the matter?" Alistair didn't hear him. His universe had shrunk to the few square inches of navy blue fabric on Clara's cardigan. "The brooch," he repeated, his voice raspy, desperate. "I asked you a question. Where did you get it?" Clara's hand instinctively flew to her chest, her fingers curling around the cool, familiar shape of the silver bird. It was a gesture of comfort she'd made thousands of times. The brooch was her talisman, her quiet connection to a world of beauty and history that felt so distant from her own frantic existence. It wasn't valuable in a monetary sense, but to her it was priceless. This sudden predatory focus on it from this monster of a man sent a new sharp spear of fear through her. First he takes her job. Now this? Was he going to accuse her of theft? I bought it, she stammered, taking an involuntary half-step back. Her mind was a maelstrom. Jean-Pierre hovered a few feet away, his expression a tightrope walk between anxiety and confusion. "Bought it where? From whom?" Alistair pressed, his voice regaining a sliver of its commanding tone. But it was frayed, brittle. He began to rise from his chair, his tall frame unfolding, casting a long, intimidating shadow over her. Clara felt trapped. The story of the brooch was her own. It was a small, personal joy, a memory of a rare, perfect afternoon, a secret she cherished. The idea of this cruel, powerful man laying claim to it, even just the story of it, felt like a deep violation. "With all due respect, sir, I don't see how that's any of your business," she said, a spark of her innate stubbornness finally burning through the fog of fear. Alistair's eyes narrowed. Under any other circumstances, such defiance would have been met with swift and overwhelming force. But these were not other circumstances. This was a ghost story materializing before his very eyes. He remembered the maker's mark, a detail he had insisted upon, hidden on the underside of the pin. A tiny stylized S entwined with a willow branch. The artisan's initial, Sylvan, in the willow for the street where Eleanor had been born. "My starling," he had called her, for her quick, bright intelligence and the way she could never stay still. She was the one true, uncomplicated love in a life built on strategic alliances and adversarial negotiations. When he lost her, the color had drained from his world, leaving him in a perpetual, monochromatic twilight. "I will ask you one last time," Alistair said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet pitch. "Tell me where you found that brooch. It is of vital, earth-shattering importance." Marcus Thorne let out a derisive snort. "For God's sake, Alistair, it's a trinket. The girl probably found it in a thrift store. Let's not derail a $10 billion conversation for a piece of costume jewelry." "Stay out of this, Marcus," Alistair snapped, his eyes never leaving Clara. He reached for his wallet, the supple leather groaning as he opened it. He pulled out a thick sheath of $100 bills, more cash than Clara had ever seen in one place. He slapped them on the table. $5,000, he said to Clara, his gaze flickering from her shocked face to the hummingbird. "For that pin, right now." The insult was reflexive, a lifetime habit of assigning a price to everything, of devaluing things to possess them. But Clara wasn't insulted. She was horrified. Sell her hummingbird? She would sooner sell a kidney. "No," she said, her voice finding a surprising firmness. The fear was still a cold stone in her stomach, but it was being eclipsed by a fiercely protective anger. "It is not for sale." 10,000, he countered instantly, his eyes holding a manic gleam. 20, name a price. I will have that brooch. The spectacle was surreal. Alistair Cromwell, a titan of industry, a man who moved markets with a single phone call, was publicly unraveling over a small silver pin on a waitress's sweater. For the first time, Clara saw past the corporate tyrant. She saw a hairline crack in the marble facade, and through it, she glimpsed a man drowning. "Sir," she said, her voice steady and clear, "you could offer me your entire company. I would not sell you this brooch. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe I have been fired." She turned on her heel, her body rigid with a mixture of terror and resolve. She had to escape before the dam of her composure broke completely. "Wait!" Alistair's voice was no longer a command. It was a plea. It stopped her dead in her tracks. He sank back into his chair, dragging a hand down his face. The ruthless CEO had evaporated, leaving behind a desperate, broken father. He knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating that the brooch was Eleanor's. There were only two possibilities. Either this young woman had stumbled upon it by some impossible chance, or she was connected to its journey after Eleanor disappeared. The official story of the sailing accident had always felt wrong, a too neat conclusion to a messy, rebellious life. He had accepted it in a haze of grief, but a splinter of doubt had remained lodged deep in his heart. He had to change tactics. The bully had failed. The buyer had failed. Now he had to try being human. "Please," he said, the words sounding rusted and foreign on his tongue. "Don't go. I apologize for my behavior." The apology landed in the silent restaurant with the force of a sonic boom. Marcus Thorne's eyebrows disappeared into his hairline. Jean-Pierre looked as if he might need medical attention. Alistair continued, his voice softer now, laced with an urgency that was utterly genuine. "My reaction, it was inexcusable. But that brooch, it belonged to my daughter." He paused, the next words tearing their way out of him. "My daughter Eleanor, she died 7 years ago. That brooch was lost with her. To see it now, on you, I don't understand." Clara turned back slowly, her anger dissolving into a bewildering wave of empathy. His daughter. The words rewrote the entire evening. She looked down at the silver bird, then back at the shattered man in the $5,000 suit. "We need to talk," Alistair said, his eyes pleading. "Not here, somewhere private. I will compensate you for your time, for the distress I have caused. I will ensure you keep your job. I will do anything. But you must tell me the story of how my daughter's hummingbird pin came to be in your possession." Clara's mind was a high-speed collision of thoughts. This changed everything. The brooch was no longer just her secret treasure. It was a relic, a direct, physical link to this man's profound tragedy. Her simple, grinding life had just intersected with a universe of unimaginable wealth and sorrow. And at the epicenter of the collision was a 7-year-old mystery she never knew she was a part of. She looked at Alistair Cromwell, truly looked at him, and saw not a monster, but a father searching for the ghost of his child. She knew, with a heavy, sinking feeling of inevitability, that she had no choice. "All right," she heard herself say, the words sealing her fate. "We'll talk." The next afternoon, they met in a small, book-lined cafe in Andersonville, a neighborhood that felt a world away from the cold, corporate heart of the Loop. Clara had chosen it deliberately. It was her territory, a place of worn wooden floors, the smell of aging paper, and quiet intellectualism. It was a place Alistair Cromwell would never have found on his own. He arrived looking like a hawk in a sparrow's nest, his charcoal gray suit an alien uniform against the cafe's bohemian warmth. He was alone, a small concession to her request for neutrality that she appreciated. He slid into the booth opposite her, his face etched with a tension that seemed to have aged him a decade overnight. "Thank you for meeting me," he began, his voice devoid of the previous night's venom. Today it was just weary. "You wanted a story," Clara said, her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug of peppermint tea. The brooch was pinned to her simple blouse, a silent third party at the table. "About the brooch." "The truth," he said, his eyes fixed on it. "Every detail, please." Clara took a deep, steadying breath and began. "It was about 2 years ago. I was working on a paper for my undergraduate degree, a historical survey of artisanal guilds in the Midwest. My research took me to a small town in southern Wisconsin, a place called Mineral Point. It's an old lead mining town, full of stone buildings and antique shops." She paused, gathering the memory. "I had a free afternoon. I was wandering through one of those shops, the kind that smells of dust and cedar. It was filled with old tools, furniture, forgotten things. And there, in a glass case filled with tarnished silver and costume jewelry, I saw it." She looked down at the hummingbird. "I've always loved them. My grandmother, my foster grandmother, had feeders in her yard. They always seemed so resilient, so impossibly strong for something so delicate. This one, it was different. The craftsmanship was incredible. It wasn't mass-produced. It was art. She looked up, meeting his intense gaze. I turned it over, and I saw the maker's mark. Alistair leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. What did you see? It was tiny, Clara said, a flicker of the academic passion she usually reserved for classrooms lighting her eyes. An S intertwined with a willow branch. I recognized it. Sylvanus Thorne, a silversmith from Vermont. He was part of a very small, very exclusive neo-artisan movement in the late 90s. His work is incredibly rare. Finding a piece in a Wisconsin junk shop was like finding a lost folio of Shakespeare. Every word from Clara was a small, sharp blow against the wall of the story Alistair had told himself for 7 years. His private investigators, the best money could buy, had found nothing. But this young woman, with her librarian's eye for detail, had identified the one unique clue he had overlooked. I bought it for $30, Clara finished softly. The shop owner thought it was just a pretty piece of silver. To me, it was a treasure, a little piece of history and beauty. That's the whole story. I never imagined. Her voice trailed off. Alistair was silent for a long time, staring out the window at a world that seemed to have turned gray. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy, thick with a confession that had been poisoning his soul for years. The accident, he said, the words tasting like rust. The sailing trip. It was a lie, a story I constructed. Clara stared at him, her mind struggling to keep up. A lie? But why? Everyone said she was gone. Because I drove her away, he confessed, the guilt a palpable force in the small booth. The story came pouring out of him then, a torrent of regret and hubris. Eleanor. She was like that hummingbird, bright, fierce, always in motion. She had a spine of steel, and she had discovered something ugly. He explained that Eleanor, who had a passion for investigative journalism, had been working on an exposé for her university paper. She had stumbled upon a complex financial fraud scheme, a sophisticated Ponzi scheme that specifically targeted the pensions of city employees, teachers, firefighters, sanitation workers. She traced it all the way to the top, Alistair said, his voice laced with a bitter, painful pride. To a man I knew, a man I did business with. He looked up and his eyes were chips of ice. Marcus Thorne. Clara gasped, the name landing like a punch. The man from the restaurant. Thorne's son had been at university with Eleanor. He was obsessed with her. When she rejected him, he began to stalk her. It was through him that she first heard whispers of his father's creative accounting. She dug in. She found proof, hard proof. When she confronted Thorne, he threatened her. Not with lawyers. He threatened her life. Alistair's face contorted. I told her to drop it. I told her I would handle it. I would use my power, my money to crush Thorne quietly. I would protect her. But Eleanor, she saw it as me trying to control her again. She called my protection another gilded cage. She didn't want the criminals buried. She wanted them exposed. She wanted justice for the people they were robbing. We had a terrible fight, the worst we ever had. I told her she was being naive. She told me I was a coward. He took a ragged breath. That night she disappeared. She left a note. It just said, I have to do this my way. Don't look for me. I was terrified. I thought Thorne had gotten to her. To protect her, to make Thorne believe he'd won and stop his hunt, I created the story of the boating accident. I used my resources to make it look real. I mourned her publicly, all while secretly, desperately searching for her myself. He finally looked at Clara, his eyes swimming with a grief so profound it was almost unbearable to witness. All these years I thought she was in hiding from Thorne, angry at me, but alive, fighting her fight. But if her brooch, a piece she never took off, ended up in a random antique shop in Wisconsin, what does that mean? How did it get there? Did she sell it? Did she lose it? Or did something happen to her? The cafe, with its comforting scent of coffee and old books, suddenly felt like the first scene of a much darker story. The silver hummingbird on Clara's blouse was no longer a beautiful object. It was a clue, a cold 7-year-old breadcrumb left by a girl who was fighting a war her own father never understood. The antique shop, Clara said, her mind, trained to catalog and connect information, starting to spin. It was on Commerce Street. The owner's name was Elias. He was an old man. Maybe he'll remember who sold it to him. Alistair looked at her, a new light in his eyes. It wasn't the glare of a CEO or the vacant stare of a grieving father. It was the focused intensity of a man with a mission. He had been chasing a ghost. Now, for the first time in 7 years, he had a trail. You said you recognize the maker's mark, he said slowly, an idea forming. You have a knowledge base my people clearly lack. You see details. I need your help, Miss Mayhew. I want to hire you to help me find out what happened to my daughter. The offer hung in the air between them. It was absurd. A billionaire hiring the waitress he had tried to fire just the night before to solve the central mystery of his life. But in that moment, they were not a billionaire and a waitress. They were two people connected by a silver hummingbird standing at the edge of a 7-year-old abyss, about to take a leap of faith into the darkness. The quiet Andersonville Cafe became the unlikely headquarters for their nascent investigation. Alistair, accustomed to boardrooms and sterile offices, seemed out of place yet completely focused, a predator who had finally caught a scent. He was a man of immediate, decisive action. On his phone, he dispatched orders with quiet, lethal efficiency, mobilizing a team that had, for 7 years, been chasing shadows. My head of security is a man named David Chen, Alistair explained, his voice a low hum. Ex-FBI, meticulous. He and his team have followed 100 dead ends for me. Now, for the first time, they have a tangible starting point, a place, a name. Clara watched, mesmerized, as this man's world sprang into action. Within the hour, Chen was on a conference call, his disembodied voice crisp and professional. Clara, feeling like a character in a spy novel, repeated her story, this time to a man who absorbed every detail, not as narrative, but as data. The name of the town, Mineral Point. The name of the shop, the owner, Elias. The description of the brooch. We'll have a team in Mineral Point by morning, Chen's voice crackled through the phone speaker. They'll speak with this Elias. We'll check his sales records, tax filings, everything. See if he remembers the transaction. In the meantime, I'm reopening the deep dive on Marcus Thorne. If Eleanor was on to his financials 7 years ago, there might be a digital trail we missed, a ghost in his machine. Focus on his personal accounts, not just corporate, Alistair commanded. Look for quiet payments, shell corporations, anything that suggests a fixer. As Chen's invisible army went to work, Alistair turned his full attention back to Clara. He looked at her, truly looked at her, with an appraising gaze. He was seeing beyond the apron and the flushed cheeks. He was seeing the sharp, analytical mind that had spotted the clue his own high-priced team had missed. The artisan, he said suddenly. Sylvanus Thorne. You know his work. Do you know where he is? He retired years ago, Clara said, pulling the information from her mental archive. He was notoriously reclusive, lived somewhere in the Green Mountains of Vermont. No phone, no internet. He corresponded with clients by letter. Find him, Alistair said to Chen over the phone. I don't care what it takes. Get a team out there. Show him a picture of the brooch. Show him a picture of Eleanor. He might remember something. The next 24 hours were a blur for Clara. She was swept up in the slipstream of Alistair Cromwell's life. He installed her in a suite at the Peninsula, explaining it was a matter of security, though it felt more like being a prized piece of evidence that needed to be kept under guard. For the first time, she experienced a world where any problem could be solved, any information retrieved with a quiet phone call. It was both intoxicating and terrifying. The first breakthrough came from Chen's team in Mineral Point. Elias, the antique shop owner, was an elderly man with a failing memory, but his wife kept meticulous, handwritten records. 2.5 years ago, an entry, silver bird pin, bought for $15 from local estate sale. The estate belonged to a woman named Margaret Allen, a retired schoolteacher who had lived alone and passed away without any close family. It was a potential dead end. How did Margaret Allen get the brooch? The second breakthrough came from the team in Vermont. After a day of trekking through remote mountain roads, they found him. Sylvanus Thorne, the artisan, now a stooped man in his 80s with hands gnarled by arthritis, but eyes that were still sharp. He recognized the brooch instantly. The hummingbird, he said, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. He remembered the commission from Alistair, but then he told them something that made Alistair's blood run cold. "About a year after I made that one," Sylvana said, "the young woman, the one with the sad, fierce eyes, she wrote to me herself. She wanted another piece." Alistair listened on speakerphone, his knuckles white. "What kind of piece?" "A locket," Sylvana said. "Silver like the bird. But she wanted it shaped like a star, a North Star. She was very specific about the engraving inside." "What did it say?" Alistair whispered. "It said, 'For Leo, find your own sky.'" Leo, a name, not a place, not a clue, but a person. Who was Leo? A friend? A lover? The name meant nothing to Alistair. While Alistair wrestled with this new painful mystery, Clara was in her hotel suite, unable to sit still. She felt a profound responsibility not just to Alistair, but to the ghost of Eleanor. She requested access to Chen's digital archives, everything they had on Eleanor. Her old college emails, social media profiles, papers she had written. Alistair granted it without hesitation. For hours, Clara sifted through the digital remains of a life. She read Eleanor's fiery editorials, her passionate essays on justice. She saw photos of her smiling with friends, a life full of promise. Then she found it. Tucked away in a subfolder of a research project was a scanned document, an old hand-drawn map of the lead mining region of Wisconsin. It was from the 19th century. In the corner of the map, Eleanor had made a tiny, handwritten annotation in ink. It was next to a symbol for an old abandoned mine shaft. The note simply said, "Margaret knew." Margaret Allen, the retired school teacher whose estate had contained the brooch. It wasn't a random connection. Clara's heart pounded. She cross-referenced Margaret Allen's name with Eleanor's university records. Margaret Allen had been a guest lecturer in one of Eleanor's history seminars a semester before she disappeared. The topic, the Underground Railroad in the Upper Midwest. "She wasn't just hiding," Clara said, bursting into Alistair's ad hoc command center in the adjacent suite. "She had help. Margaret Allen was helping her." It was the missing link. Eleanor hadn't just run blindly into the wilderness. She had a plan. She had an ally. Margaret, a history teacher with deep local knowledge, had likely provided her with a new identity, a place to live, a way to disappear off the grid. The brooch, left in her estate, was probably something Eleanor had given her as a gift, or perhaps left with her for safekeeping. The new question was terrifying. If Margaret Allen had passed away, what happened to Eleanor? And who, in God's name, was Leo? A new urgency propelled them. The search was no longer about a piece of jewelry. It was about a person named Leo. Chen's team, with a new focus, started digging into Margaret Allen's life. She was a spinster, but she had a sister who had passed away years earlier, leaving behind a single child, a nephew who had become estranged. His name was Michael. He had a history of petty crime and had fallen off the map years ago. It seemed like another dead end until Chen's financial team, digging through Thorne's accounts, found the needle in the haystack. A recurring monthly payment, small but steady, being made from a slush fund to an account in rural Wisconsin. The payments had started 7 years ago. They had stopped 2 years ago, right around the time Margaret Allen died. The account holder was listed as Michael Gable, Margaret Allen's nephew. The pieces slammed into place with sickening force. "Thorne found her," Alistair said, his voice hollow. "He didn't go after her himself. He found her one vulnerability, her protector's estranged, greedy nephew. He paid him to watch her, to report on her." The picture was ugly and clear. Eleanor, living in hiding under Margaret's protection, was being surveilled. When Margaret died, Eleanor's safety net was gone. She would have been exposed, vulnerable. The final piece came from a real estate search. A small isolated cabin on the edge of the state forest, about 10 miles outside of Mineral Point. It had been purchased with cash 7 years ago by Margaret Allen. It had been sold 2 years ago in a foreclosure auction, its sole occupant having vanished. "We're going to Wisconsin," Alistair said, his face a mask of grim determination. "Now." He looked at Clara, and for the first time he saw her not as an assistant or a consultant, but as a partner in this agonizing quest. You're coming with me. He needed her clear eyes, her steady mind. He needed the person who saw the details he had always been too arrogant to notice. She had found the path, and he knew, with a chilling certainty, that they had to walk it to its end together. The drive to rural Wisconsin was a silent, 4-hour pilgrimage through a landscape that grew progressively quieter and more isolated. The concrete towers of Chicago gave way to flat farmland, then to the rolling wooded hills that concealed the state's mining history. The cabin, when they found it at the end of a long, unpaved road, was small and weathered, sinking back into the earth. It was heartbreakingly ordinary. Chen's team had already secured the property. It had been empty for 2 years, but they had prevented the bank from clearing it out. As Alistair stepped across the threshold, he felt as if he were entering a sacred tomb. The air was thick with the dust of abandonment, but Eleanor's presence was everywhere. A stack of books on a small table, a faded photograph of a smiling, dark-haired woman. Eleanor, looking older, more tired, but with the same fire in her eyes, pinned to a corkboard. On a small hand-built shelf was a collection of rocks and pressed wildflowers. It was the home of a person who had found a measure of peace in solitude. Clara moved through the space with a quiet reverence. Her eyes, trained to find patterns, scanned everything. She was a ghost, Clara whispered. No credit cards, no bills in her own name. Margaret must have paid for everything. In the single bedroom, they found the heart of the mystery. A small, child-sized bed stood in the corner. Tacked to the wall above it was a child's drawing of the night sky with a lopsided star labeled North Star. On a small nightstand was a worn copy of Goodnight Moon. Alistair sank onto the edge of the dusty adult bed, his body trembling. Leo, he breathed. He was her son, my grandson. The realization was a physical blow, a stunning combination of joy and agony. He had a grandson he had never known. Clara, her heart aching for him, continued her search. In the back of a small closet, tucked away under a loose floorboard, she found a small metal box. It was locked. Chen's associate picked it open in seconds. Inside was a birth certificate for one Leo Allen, born 5 years ago. Mother, Eleanor Allen. The father's name was left blank. Beneath it was a stack of journals filled with Eleanor's elegant script, and on top of the journals lay the matching silver locket, shaped like a North Star. Alistair took the locket, his large hands clumsy. He opened it. On one side was a tiny faded picture of Eleanor. On the other, a picture of a smiling baby with his own daughter's bright, intelligent eyes. That night back at a sterile motel, they read the journals. Alistair sat in one chair, Clara in another, as she read his daughter's last words aloud, her voice soft and steady in the quiet room. Eleanor wrote of her flight, of Margaret's kindness, of creating a new life as Anna. She wrote of falling in love with a local man, a naturalist who worked for the state park, a kind soul who was killed in a hiking accident before he ever knew she was pregnant. She wrote of the profound, all-consuming love she had for her son, Leo. Then the entries turned dark. She wrote of Margaret's death, the terror of being alone, of seeing a strange man. Margaret's nephew, she suspected, lingering at the edge of her property. He has greedy eyes, when she wrote. I think Thorne has found me. The last entry was written in a shaky, frantic hand. The fever won't break. I can't risk a hospital. They'll ask for ID. They'll find me, find us. If something happens to me, I have a final plan. Beatrice at the town bookstore. A good woman. She will take Leo. She will keep him safe until I don't know what. I am leaving this box for him. So one day he will know he was not abandoned. He was loved. He was my whole sky. The room was silent save for the sound of Alistair Cromwell's quiet, ragged sobs. He had faked his daughter's death to protect her from a monster, only for that monster's shadow to hound her to a real one. She had died alone, of a preventable illness, likely pneumonia, because she was too terrified to seek help. Beatrice, Clara whispered, breaking the stillness. The bookstore in town. The next morning they walked into the Reader's Nook on Mineral Point's main street. An elderly woman with kind, tired eyes looked up from behind the counter. She was surrounded by towers of books. Beatrice, Alistair asked, his voice hoarse. She nodded slowly, her gaze wary. "We're here about Anna," he said, "and her son, Leo." Beatrice's face crumpled. "I knew this day would come," she sighed. She led them to a small apartment above the shop, and there, sitting on a rug, carefully building a tower of wooden blocks, was a small boy with dark curly hair and Eleanor's bright, inquisitive green eyes. He looked up at them, clutching a small stuffed bear. He was the spitting image of his mother. Alistair fell to his knees. The sound that escaped him was not a word, but a raw, primal cry of grief and love. The grandson he never knew existed was real. He was alive. He was safe. Beatrice explained everything. 2 years ago, a very sick Anna had appeared at her door in the middle of the night, holding her son's hand. She made Beatrice promise to care for him, giving her the last of her cash. She died 2 days later at the cabin, alone. Beatrice had honored her promise. She had raised Leo as her own, a secret kept by a kind woman in a small town. Later that afternoon, as Leo napped, Beatrice gave Alistair the small backpack Anna had left for her son. Inside were a few changes of clothes, the worn copy of Goodnight Moon, and a letter addressed to Leo. But tucked into a side pocket was an envelope addressed to Alistair Cromwell, his name in his daughter's handwriting, his hands shaking so violently he could barely open it. He read the last words she ever wrote to him. "Father, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and the best part of me is now in your care. I am sorry for the pain I caused you. I know you thought you were protecting me with your gilded cage, but a bird cannot live in a cage, no matter how beautiful. I had to fly. I had to try to make the world right in my own way. I failed, but I did one thing right. I made Leo. He is your grandson. Please do not fail him as you failed me. Don't try to cage him. Teach him to fly. Let him find his own sky. Your daughter, Eleanor." The letter was a final, posthumous absolution and a sacred final command. Holding it, Alistair Cromwell knew that his life's work was not his company, not his legacy of wealth, but the small boy sleeping in the next room. He looked over at Clara, the young woman who had started this journey. Her eyes were filled with tears, not of pity, but of shared understanding. She hadn't just found a brooch. She had unearthed a life, delivered a son to his family, and given a father one last precious gift from his lost daughter. The war for Cromwell Industries was over. The war for Eleanor's legacy, for Leo's future, had just begun. The journey back to Chicago was a fragile, surreal procession. In the back seat, Leo slept, buckled into a brand new car seat, clutching the stuffed bear Beatrice had given him. He was a small, breathing miracle in a world that had suddenly been remade by grief and hope. For Alistair, the roar of the city held no appeal. The only sound he cared about was the gentle rhythm of his grandson's breathing. Clara sat in the passenger seat, a silent observer of this profound tectonic shift in a man's life. She had expected to be dismissed, thanked and paid handsomely. Instead, Alistair had asked her to stay. "I don't know how to do this," he had confessed, his voice stripped bare of all artifice as they left the bookstore. "I know how to run a board meeting, not how to care for a 5-year-old boy who has lost everything. I need you." The first order of business upon their return was not a nursery, but a reckoning. Alistair, armed with Eleanor's journals and the evidence of Michael Gable's payoffs, summoned Marcus Thorne. Not to his office, but to the cavernous, empty living room of his penthouse, a cold marble mausoleum that hadn't felt like a home in 7 years. Thorne arrived with the smug confidence of a victor, assuming Alistair was ready to finalize the terms of his surrender. He was mistaken. Alistair didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were quiet, precise, and deadly. He laid out the story, piece by agonizing piece. Eleanor's investigation, Thorne's threats, her life in hiding, the paid informant, her death from an illness she was too terrified to have treated. "You didn't just stalk a young woman, Marcus," Alistair said, his voice a blade of ice. "You hounded her to her grave. Your obsession, your greed, it cost my daughter her life. She died alone in a cabin because of you." Thorne's smirk faltered, replaced by a pasty, ashen shock. "But she left something behind," Alistair continued, his voice dropping even lower. She left a son, my grandson, and she left proof of your crimes. The merger is off. In fact, my company is acquiring the controlling interest in yours, a process which began an hour ago when your stock price mysteriously began to plummet. And this file," he gestured to a thick binder on the table, "is being delivered to the U.S. Attorney's Office." Thorne, for the first time in his life, was speechless. He was a broken man, his empire and his liberty evaporating before his eyes. But Alistair felt no victory, only the hollow ache of a justice served 7 years too late. The days that followed were a chaotic, delicate dance. Alistair, with the help of a fleet of lawyers, began the slow, arduous process of legally establishing his guardianship of Leo. It wasn't instantaneous. There were courts, social workers, and psychologists. A bureaucratic maze he had to navigate with patience, a virtue he was only just beginning to learn. He turned to Clara for everything. She was the one who knew that Leo was scared of the dark, that he only ate his sandwiches cut into triangles, that he loved stories about constellations. She was the bridge between the grandfather and the grandson, translating their shared grief into a new language of trust. One evening after Leo was asleep, Alistair sat with Clara in the vast, silent penthouse. He slid a folder across the marble coffee table. Inside was a contract establishing a trust fund in her name, with a sum of money that made her feel dizzy. "This is for you," he said. "For everything." Clara looked at it, then pushed it back across the table. "I don't want your money, Alistair." He looked baffled. "What do you want then? Name it, anything." "I want to finish my master's degree," she said, her voice firm. "And I want to do something. Eleanor was fighting for people who had no voice. The pensioners Thorne was robbing. I want to continue that fight in my own way." She outlined her idea. A foundation funded by him, but run by her. A nonprofit dedicated to providing legal and financial advocacy for vulnerable populations, starting with children aging out of the foster system, kids like her. "I want a purpose, not a payoff," she said. Alistair looked at her, and for the first time, he fully understood the woman Eleanor had described in her last letter. He saw the same fire, the same steel spine. "Done," he said, a genuine smile touching his lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The story of Alistair Cromwell didn't end with a dramatic courtroom victory or a sudden perfect family. It unfolded slowly in a series of small, quiet moments. He sold the cold penthouse and bought a sprawling house in a leafy suburb, a house with a yard big enough for a dog and a swing set. He traded his Vacheron Constantine for a digital watch with a Mickey Mouse face that Leo had picked out. He learned how to make pancakes, how to bandage a scraped knee, how to patiently answer the 1,000 why questions of a curious 5-year-old. He learned how to be a grandfather. Clara, funded by the newly established Eleanor Starr Foundation, finished her degree with honors. She wasn't a live-in nanny or a paid companion. She was family. She was there for Sunday dinners, for holidays, for Leo's first day of school. She was the steadfast aunt, the loving guardian of his mother's memory. The woman who would sit with him and tell him stories not of a tragic victim, but of a brave, fiery woman named Eleanor, who loved him more than the sky. One crisp autumn evening, a year later, the three of them were in the backyard, wrapped in blankets, looking through a telescope Alistair had bought. He was pointing out Jupiter, his voice filled with a quiet wonder he hadn't felt since his own childhood. Leo, his small face pressed to the eyepiece, gasped in delight. Clara watched them, the powerful old man and the resilient little boy, two survivors finding their way in a new constellation. The silver hummingbird brooch was pinned to her coat. It was no longer a beautiful antique or a painful clue. It was a reminder that sometimes the most broken things can be pieced back together, not as they were, but as something new, something stronger. They were a strange, improbable family, forged in tragedy and built on the quiet, steady foundation of a second chance. And under the vast, star-filled sky, they were finally learning how to fly.